Some of the biggest bands of the 1960s and 70s didn't fade out slowly. They made one decision, said one thing, or did one thing that changed everything in an instant. Here are 10 bands from the 60s and 70s who ruined their career in seconds. Number 10, the Byrds. The Byrds had one of the more unusual career trajectories in the 1960s American rock. They essentially invented two genres, folk rock with Mr. Tambourine Man in 1965 and country rock with Sweetheart of the Rodeo in 1968, and both times managed to alienate a significant portion of their existing audience in the process of doing something genuinely innovative. But the moment that most decisively damaged their commercial standing happened not through a recording, but through a personnel decision made in 1967. When Roger McGuinn and David Crosby's creative relationship broke down irreparably, Crosby was fired from the band during the recording sessions for the notorious Byrd Brothers. Crosby took his musical instincts with him, joining Stephen Stills and Graham Nash to form Crosby, Stills and Nash, which became one of the most commercially successful acts of the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Byrds continued under McGuinn's leadership and produced genuinely adventurous music, including Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which is now recognized as a landmark, but their commercial visibility and cultural centrality declined steadily from 1968 onward. The loss of Crosby's voice, his songwriting, and his connections removed a key element from the band's identity at precisely the moment the music industry was shifting toward the kind of harmony-based, personal singer-songwriter sound that Crosby went on to help define with his new partners. The Byrds formally dissolved in 1973, having been through more lineup changes than almost any major band of the era. The original 5-member lineup that had recorded their greatest hits had essentially existed for less than 2 years. The decision to remove Crosby did not kill the band immediately. The subsequent years produced some of their most interesting work, but it began a commercial slide that the band never reversed, and the success that Crosby achieved almost immediately afterward made the comparison an ongoing commentary on what the Byrds had lost. Number 9, The Doors. The Doors had built one of the most distinctive and commercially successful identities in late 1960s rock. Jim Morrison's theatrical, literary stage persona, Robbie Krieger's guitar, Ray Manzarek's unmistakable organ, and John Densmore's rhythmic precision combined into something that was genuinely unlike anything else on the radio. By 1969, they were one of the biggest touring acts in the country, selling out arenas with a combination of musical power and the ever-present possibility that Morrison might do or say something that nobody could predict or contain. The Miami concert of March 1, 1969, is where the Doors' commercial life effectively ended. Morrison arrived hours late for a show at the Dinner Key Auditorium, where more than 10,000 people were packed into a venue licensed for a much smaller capacity in a building that had previously been a commercial airline terminal. The heat inside was extreme, the crowd was overloaded, and Morrison arrived already in a significantly altered state. What followed has been disputed in its specific details for more than 5 decades. Whether Morrison actually exposed himself on stage, as Dade County authorities subsequently charged, is something that people who were present have consistently disagreed about. The band members themselves have given different accounts at different points over the years. Manzarek insisted it did not happen. Densmore was less certain. People in the crowd reported contradictory things. What is not disputed is that the concert was chaotic. Morrison's behavior was provocative and uncontrolled in ways that went beyond anything the band had previously managed or tried to manage around, and the aftermath was severe and immediate. Warrants for Morrison's arrest were issued within days on charges including lewd and lascivious behavior, indecent exposure, and public intoxication. 23 scheduled concert dates were canceled in the immediate aftermath as venues across the country refused to honor bookings. The Miami incident effectively ended the Doors as a touring act in the United States for the remainder of their existence as a band with Morrison. He was convicted in 1970 of profanity and indecent exposure in a Miami courtroom, and was actively appealing the verdict when he died in Paris in July 1971 at the age of 27. The band recorded 2 more albums without him following his death, but found no meaningful commercial audience for that material. One night in Miami, in a concert that lasted less than an hour, ended the commercial viability of one of the most genuinely significant bands of the decade. Number 8. Sly and the Family Stone. Sly and the Family Stone were at the peak of their cultural power at the end of the 1960s. Their performance at Woodstock in August 1969 is remembered as one of the most electrifying sets of that entire festival, and their run of hits through 1968 and 1969 had placed them at the center of American popular music in a way that very few artists of any genre had managed. The band was racially integrated, musically innovative, and commercially dominant at a moment when all 3 of those things simultaneously seemed possible for a rock act. The ruination happened not in a single public moment, but through a behavioral pattern that became its own kind of self-destruction at high speed. Sly Stone's cocaine and PCP use escalated dramatically through 1970 and into the early 1970s, and the consequences became public in a very specific way. The band began missing concerts, not canceling them in advance, but simply not appearing. Audiences would arrive at venues, wait for hours, and leave without having seen a performance. Promoters across the country stopped booking the band because the risk of paying for a show that would not happen was too great to absorb commercially. The pattern of no-shows reached a scale that destroyed the band's commercial infrastructure in a period of roughly 2 to 3 years. A band that could have built on the momentum of Woodstock into something that defined the 1970s, the way they had helped define the late 1960s instead, spent the decade contracting, losing members, and watching the funk and soul sounds they had pioneered being developed more successfully by artists who were actually showing up to perform them. Sly Stone's genius was real, and the music he made when he was functional remained genuinely original. But the no-show period destroyed the trust between the band and the live music industry in a way that the eventual recording of There's a Riot Going On in 1971, a dark, brilliant, almost willfully inaccessible album, could not repair commercially. Number 7. The Mamas and the Papas. The Mamas and the Papas had achieved something remarkable in a very short time. Beginning to record in late 1965 and reaching their commercial peak through 1966 and 1967, they had become one of the most recognizable vocal groups in American pop music, with a string of hits that included California Dreamin', Monday Monday, Dedicated to the One I Love, and Creek Alley, the harmonies. 4 voices that blended in a way that was immediately identifiable and technically sophisticated, and the Los Angeles mystique they projected placed them at the center of a very specific and vivid cultural moment. The moment that ended them was not a public incident, but a private reality that had been building throughout their entire existence as a band. The complicated romantic and personal relationships among the 4 members had never been structurally manageable, and by 1968, they had become completely impossible to navigate. John Phillips and Michelle Phillips were married, and their relationship was in serious difficulty. Denny Doherty had been in love with Michelle Phillips, a situation that John Phillips was aware of and that created a persistent undercurrent of tension in every recording session and every touring situation the 4 of them occupied together. Cass Elliott's feelings for Doherty, which he did not reciprocate in the way she hoped, added another layer to an already impossibly complicated web of personal attachment and wounded feeling. The romantic entanglements ran beneath every recording and every public appearance like a structural fault. And when the group attempted to record in 1967, the sessions were described by people present as genuinely difficult in ways that the music could not absorb or conceal. The band dissolved in 1968, and the dissolution was as tangled and emotionally exhausting as everything else about the group's internal life had been. A reunion attempt in 1971 produced the album People Like Us, which sold almost nothing and was reviewed without enthusiasm, demonstrating how completely the commercial moment that had sustained them had passed. Cass Elliot had made reasonable progress as a solo artist before her death in London in July 1974 at the age of 32 from heart failure. The band that might have extended its commercial run across a full decade instead compressed its entire productive existence into roughly 3 years, undone by the impossibility of maintaining professional relationships among people whose personal lives were inextricably and chaotically interwoven from the beginning. Number 6. The Kinks. The Kinks are a complicated case because their career difficulties in the late 1960s were not primarily self-inflicted in the way that most of the other entries on this list were. They were imposed by an external band whose specific origins remain somewhat disputed. In May 1965, following a tour of the United States that had been marked by conflicts with American musicians, union officials, and various incidents involving band members' behavior, the American Federation of Musicians effectively barred the Kinks from performing in the United States. The specific incidents that triggered the ban have been reported differently in different accounts over the years, and there were altercations, conflicts with promoters and officials, and behavior that the union found unacceptable. But the result was unambiguous. The ban lasted from 1965 until 1969. 4 years during which the British invasion was at its commercial and cultural peak. The Beatles were recording Sgt. Pepper's, Revolver, and the White Album. The Rolling Stones were finding their fullest commercial power, and the American market was producing enormous financial rewards and cultural influence for British rock acts that could tour there regularly and maintain their presence in front of American audiences. The Kinks, who had begun the decade as one of the most commercially promising British rock acts with You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night in 1964, were completely locked out of that market during the precise years when it mattered most. Ray Davies responded to the ban by turning inward and writing some of the most critically admired, idiosyncratic, and quintessentially English music in the British rock canon: the Village Green Preservation Society album, the Arthur album, and a series of concept records that are now regarded as masterpieces of late 1960s rock writing. None of them sold particularly well at the time, partly because the American market that had been generating so much commercial momentum for British bands was unavailable to them. When the Kinks were finally able to return to touring America in 1969, the cultural landscape had shifted dramatically, and the band spent the 1970s attempting to rebuild a commercial profile that the 4-year absence had allowed to atrophy during the most commercially important window of the era. The specific incidents that triggered the ban effectively redirected the Kinks away from the mainstream commercial success they might have consolidated in 1965 and 1966, and toward a cult status that they retained for the remainder of the decade. Number 5. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young were one of the most commercially powerful and culturally significant acts of the early 1970s. Their 1970 album Deja Vu reached number 1 on the Billboard Albums chart and produced some of the most enduring recordings of the era. The live album 4-Way Street, released in 1971, demonstrated the enormous scale of their audience. Neil Young's contributions in particular, both his songwriting and his guitar work, had given the band a harder, more mercurial edge that distinguished them from the softer harmony sound of Crosby, Stills, and Nash as a trio. And then, the combination of 4 enormous, individual egos, fundamentally incompatible personal chemistry and extended proximity, escalating substance use, and the inherent impossibility of managing 4 separately ambitious and creatively territorial artists within a single commercial unit produced a series of breakups, reunions, and failed creative projects that defined the rest of the decade. The specific moment that most damaged the band's commercial standing and creative potential came in 1974 when what was marketed as one of the most anticipated concert tours in rock history, a CSNY reunion following years of separate solo careers, was experienced by virtually everyone involved as genuinely punishing. Neil Young has described the 1974 stadium tour with considerable candor in later interviews and in his memoir, noting that he found the experience artistically unsatisfying in ways that he could not overlook or compartmentalize. David Crosby's escalating cocaine use had become visible and disruptive in ways that affected the band's ability to function cohesively at their best. The harmony between the 4 members that had made their best recordings feel effortless and inevitable was present on some nights in genuinely stunning form and absent on others with no reliable predictability, leaving audiences and the band themselves uncertain about what any given night would produce. The 1974 tour did not produce any lasting recorded output. A proposed live album from the extensive tour was conceived, discussed, and ultimately abandoned. The opportunity to consolidate the commercial momentum of a major, highly publicized reunion into a sustained second creative chapter was lost in the atmosphere of internal friction and mutual exhaustion that the tour generated. CSNY would not tour together again as a full foursome for 3 decades. The window in which they might have produced a second body of work comparable to their early 1970s peak, the kind of sustained creative run that would have set them permanently alongside the great bands of the era, rather than alongside the great almost were stories, closed during the 1974 tour and never reopened. Number 4. The Velvet Underground.
When the blood begins to flow.
The Velvet Underground's career destruction was different in character from most of the other entries on this list. It was not a public scandal, a tour ban, or a pattern of no-shows that alienated the live music industry. It was something quieter and in some ways more complete and permanent. The band simply never had a commercially successful album during its active existence. Their first album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, released in 1967 and produced by Andy Warhol, is now routinely cited as one of the most influential albums in the history of rock music. At the time of its release, it did not chart in the United States at all. Their second album, White Lights, White Heat, released in January 1968, also failed to chart and was even more confrontational in its approach than the debut. Nico had already departed, and the band's direction was moving toward longer, more experimental pieces that made commercial radio airplay essentially impossible. By the time of the third album in 1969, the band had changed record labels, softened their approach somewhat, and produced material that was more accessible in certain respects without being accessible enough to find a mainstream audience.
I've decided a couple of things.
The departure of Lou Reed in 1970, following internal tensions involving the direction of the band and his relationship with the other members, effectively ended the Velvet Underground's creative existence, even though the remaining members recorded one final album under the name. Reed had been the band's primary songwriter, its most distinctive lyrical voice, and the person most responsible for the specific artistic identity that made the Velvet Underground significant. His departure left a band that had never achieved commercial success without the person most central to what had made them artistically distinctive. The commercial death of the Velvet Underground happened not in a single dramatic public moment, but through the accumulation of decisions and circumstances that kept them perpetually beyond the reach of any audience larger than the small, devoted one they maintained in New York and among the underground rock community. Brian Eno's observation that the first album sold only 30,000 copies, but everyone who bought one started a band captures something essential about the relationship between their commercial failure and their influence. Both were absolute.
'Cause when the blood begins to flow.
Number 3. The Grateful Dead at Altamont. The Grateful Dead are often discussed in relation to Altamont, the free concert held at the Altamont Speedway in Livermore, California, in December 1969. But their connection to that event is more nuanced than most people realize. The Dead had been involved in the planning of the concert and were scheduled to perform. They did not. After arriving at the venue, observing the chaos and violence that was already developing, including the use of Hells Angels Motorcycle Club members as de facto security, an arrangement that had seemed workable to some of the organizers, and that would prove catastrophically wrong, the Dead made the decision not to take the stage. What I ever need. The decision not to perform was the right call by any reasonable assessment. By the time the Rolling Stones headlined that evening, a young man named Meredith Hunter had been killed by Hells Angels security personnel in front of the stage, and the concert had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the utopian idealism of the 1960s counterculture. The Dead's non-performance protected them from direct association with the worst of what happened. But the Altamont disaster, taken together with the band's association with the San Francisco psychedelic scene and the entire cultural moment it represented, contributed to a broader public perception of the 1960s counterculture as having collapsed under its own contradictions. For the Grateful Dead specifically, Altamont did not ruin their career in any commercial sense. They went on to decades of touring success and a devoted fan base whose loyalty was exceptional by any standard. But it marked the end of the specific cultural moment in which the values they represented had been at the center of mainstream cultural conversation, and the transition from that moment to what came after was something neither the Dead nor anyone else who had been part of the San Francisco scene could fully manage or control. Number 2, the Beatles. No band's career destruction has been more analyzed, argued over, and relitigated than the Beatles, and the specific moment most often cited as the point at which the end became inevitable was the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in August 1967. Epstein had managed the band since 1962, negotiating their recording contract with EMI, orchestrating their American breakthrough, and maintaining a professional structure around 4 people whose individual personalities and ambitions would otherwise have pulled in incompatible directions much sooner than they ultimately did.
Hey Jude, don't make it.
After Epstein's death from an accidental drug overdose, the Beatles attempted to manage their own affairs through Apple Corps, the company they founded in 1968. The results were chaotic. Apple became a financial drain that required the intervention of Alan Klein, a manager whose methods were acceptable to Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, but that McCartney found deeply troubling and refused to accept. The legal and personal conflicts around Klein's management became one of the central fault lines along which the band broke apart between 1969 and 1970. The recording of Let It Be in January 1969, captured on film and eventually released as a documentary that showed the band in open conflict, documented the interpersonal tensions that had made continuing together effectively impossible. The Beatles formally dissolved in 1970. John Lennon's public announcement came in September of that year, though the legal proceedings continued for years. In the 12 months between the recording of the Let It Be sessions and the release of Let It Be as an album, the most commercially successful band in the history of popular music ceased to exist as a functioning unit. Epstein's death had not been an instant career-ending moment in the way that some of the other events on this list were, but the absence of his managerial stability created the conditions in which the tensions that had always existed within the band could no longer be contained. Number 1, the Sex Pistols. The Sex Pistols compressed an entire career into less than 3 years and then ended it in one of the most dramatically public conclusions in rock history. The band formed in London in 1975, released their debut and only studio album, Never Mind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols in October 1977 and played their final concert as an original lineup at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco on January 14, 1978, a period of roughly 26 months from formation to dissolution. The American tour of January 1978 was the endpoint. The band had accepted bookings primarily in the American South: Baton Rouge, Dallas, San Antonio, Tulsa, and San Francisco. Venues that were either poorly chosen relative to where Punk's American audience was concentrated, or chosen specifically for the confrontational dynamic that such bookings would produce. The performances were marked by hostility from audiences who had come to see what the fuss was about rather than from genuine punk enthusiasts, by Sid Vicious's visibly deteriorating condition from heroin use, and by a growing internal tension between Johnny Rotten and the band's manager Malcolm McLaren over the direction of everything. At the Winterland show, Johnny Rotten ended the performance by asking the crowd whether they had ever felt like they had been cheated, a question that was addressed as much to his bandmates and his manager as it was to the audience in front of him. He left the stage and effectively left the band at the same moment. Vicious died of a heroin overdose in February 1979, just weeks after being released on bail related to the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. McLaren's subsequent attempts to reframe the band's story as a piece of performance art or situationist provocation did not restore the Sex Pistols as a commercial entity. What the Sex Pistols accomplished in their brief existence was genuinely significant. Never Mind the Bollocks changed British rock music and the culture around it in ways that continued to resonate for decades. But the career that produced those changes was ended at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco at the conclusion of a disastrous American tour, in a moment so perfectly symbolic that it has been analyzed and discussed ever since as though it were scripted. It was not scripted, which is what made it so complete. If any of these stories sound familiar, you were paying attention during one of the most unpredictable and turbulent periods in the history of rock music. Careers that took years to build sometimes ended in an evening. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more where this came from.